Well, thank you all for being here. And so what we're going to do is take you through a gigantically quick tour of the history of the Anglican Church. Okay, starting with Jesus Christ. Okay, so that's quite a ways back there. And so, you know, I think a lot of us think that whenever you think of the history of the Anglican Church, we think of Henry VIII, right? You know, because, and that's true, that's whenever the split occurred, so that was... you know, whenever he came in there, we'll talk about that in detail, but you know, there's a whole heck of a lot of the church that went on before Henry VIII got here. And so we want to just highlight that real quickly by taking you on a tour of 1,500 years, just very quickly. So what we have here is a really brief, concise history. And so let's just show how Christianity developed, because the story of Christianity is the story of the Anglican Church for the first 1,500 years. So here we go. We're talking about the continent, and the continent is, of course, Europe is where a lot of Rome and Roman behavior took place, and Anglican takes place in Britannia, the development of the Church of England. So, did we have Christianity in England before Henry VIII came around? Of course we did. And so it was Celtic Christianity. So that's what happened at first, under the Roman guide. And so what you had here is different components of England with very Roman names, like Londinium, okay, UM at the end of that. Things like Maxima Caesaronius, you know. So they had all those different Roman titles. But the first hundreds of years were Celtic rule. And then what happened next was... you know, on the continent, so in Europe, you had persecutions going on. So you had Diocletian and different emperors who felt that Christianity now was becoming a political threat. And so Christians on the continent were being martyred. And so the question was, did Christians get martyred in England? And the answer is yes. And so there was, and this is one of the English saints, there was a man, a monk, by the name of, well, he wasn't a monk yet, of Alban. And so in somewhere between 209 and 304, he was martyred for housing and giving sanctuary to a priest. And so they found out about that, and the Roman armies beheaded him. And on that spot where he was beheaded, they have this beautiful church to St. Alban in England. So we know that that occurred. We also know another little thing. There was a Council of Arles, which called in all the bishops from the continent, and the problem was that there was a heresy going on, and the heresy was the heresy of what you call Donatism or Donatism, which said that if your priest wasn't holy, then your sacrament wasn't holy. Now, wouldn't that be a great one to have today? so that was the heresy. And so the bishops convened a synod to discuss that, and we know that 3 British bishops were present for that. Okay, so we know that. That's in the history book, so we know that there was a little bit of hierarchy. Now, in around 410, the year 410, the Romans, the Holy Roman Empire, the Roman Empire, started to realize that they couldn't draw from Brittany anymore. So they kind of like gave up, and the last British legion that was drawn from Britannia was in 410. Now, because Rome is pulling out of Britannia, or what's going to soon be called England, it was up for grabs. And so who grabbed it was the Anglo-Saxons, the Germanic tribes started to grab them. And now, before that all occurred, monasticism started to grow. And so this was another Christian development, and the monasteries took root on the continent, but they also started to grow in England, and that became an interesting movement, because with the monasteries, we know a couple things. Bishops existed in Britain, but they didn't have much authority. But whenever you start to have things like monasteries, which became their own living communities. They became the centers for education. They became the places where you would sometimes send your kid if you didn't have the money to make sure that your kid was successful. You could send them to the monastery. And things like that happened. They became very, very influential kinds of places. And so, you know, and this is kind of new in a church, because like it says up here, the bishops existed, but they didn't have much authority. And Britain was not really under papal authority per se. You know, Rome kind of felt that they had them somewhat, but it was kind of hodgepodge at that point in time. But with the rise of the monasteries, then you had the person in charge was the abbot, and the abbot started to become a pretty powerful man. Now, there is reason to believe that some women were abbots too, you know, but of convents. Like, for example, in the Benedictine movement, you know, St. Benedict, of course, had his monastery, and his sister Scholastica led a convent. But it was always seen that that was a lower place than the actual abbey. So the abbot was very powerful, kind of like, once you became the abbot, you became like the town leader. So, here's what we know. There were 200 monasteries in continental Europe and Britain by the 6th century. There was 1,000 plus of them by the 9th century, just in 300 years. So the influence of the monasteries was getting pretty big. Britannia now, through the monasteries, is starting to get Christianized. In 597, you have 40 monks and priests arrive in Kent, sent directly from Pope Gregory. One of them was Augustine the monk. Some of you may have heard of him, who ended up in Canterbury, and that's why we have an Archbishop of Canterbury. But a little bit of this, you know, as we go historically. So the continent is getting lots of monasteries. The monks and priests are coming to set up more monasteries in England, sent by Gregory the Great. And his mother Sylvia sent the monks mills. We know that. Gregory was bold. He took Christianity to the outer edge. Now that's kind of an interesting concept, because England was the far reaches of the kingdom at that point in time. So this was like going to, you know, I don't know where today that we would consider maybe Mars, you know, or someplace like that. And so Augustine the monk becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury, and I'll tell you why here in a couple moments. And Augustine, who was sent by Pope Gregory the Great, his job was to win Britannia back. Because when the Anglo-Saxons took over, Rome lost their grip on Christianity in England. So, the job of Augustine was to make Canterbury the Rome of Britannia. Augustine was given a Rome connection symbol from Gregory. Does anyone know what that is? It was called the pallium, or the pallium. And it looked like this. And it's currently on the seal of the Archbishop of Canterbury. It's still on that. So that's a little bit from that history. Now, why did Augustine end up in Canterbury? That's an interesting question, okay? Because Adalbert, who was a Germanic leader, so an Anglo-Saxon, he fell in love with a lady by the name of Bertha. And Bertha was a Christian. And so all of a sudden, you had a Anglo-Saxon leader, namely Adalbert, who was open to Christians. And so he settled around Canterbury. And that's how we got our first archbishopric in Canterbury. And ever since then, it remains. So that's kind of an interesting piece of history. You know, so that's Gregory, and that's Augustine, the monk. So, if you want to, where is Canterbury? If someone is better in, it's way out in this area, I think, isn't it? Yeah. So that's where Canterbury is in this portion of England, down here. It's not London. So there's the Cathedral of Canterbury. Now this features a couple hundred years later. Does anyone remember the story of Thomas Becket? Don't know if you know that. Did anyone ever see the movie called Murder in the Cathedral? Okay. And so we'll talk a little historically about that as well. So where we are at this point is around 700, 800, and we're starting to see, some reasons why things developed as they did, especially with Canterbury Christianity. So all the way up to 1042, you have Anglo-Saxon territories coming together to form Britain, and then your last Anglo-Saxon king was St. Edward the Confessor. Now, we're all the way up to 1042, somewhere like that. So it's a quick history. You can see that on your next page, I think it is. He was canonized a saint, or at least called a saint, because of many pious acts that he made. And he was a pretty good leader. But he was the last Saxon king. Now, does anyone know what happens next in history? Yes?
The Celtic bishops.
Yes.
They were Christians, but they followed Rome. That's what Rome wanted.
Well, they're starting. That's how they originally were. They were not under Rome, but they were existing. But Rome still kind of claimed them a little bit. There was a lot of confusion going on there. There was attempts made by Rome to Christianize and to become their leader and put them under them. But it was a fight. You know,
the Celtic bishops, were they Christian?
Well, they were Christian, yes. They were Christian. These bishops who then led, but they didn't have a lot of power. So then, why I mentioned Edward the Confessor, the last Anglo-Saxon king, is he founded an abbey, and that abbey was on the Thames River, and it ends up becoming Westminster Abbey, okay? Which was an interesting thing. And did you ever hear the story, robbing Peter to pay Paul? Okay, this is a little bit about where that comes from, eventually, okay, because that abbey, which became Westminster Abbey, was called the Monastery of St. Peter, okay, or the Church of St. Peter, and monks lived there. So, and this was founded by St. Edward the Confessor. Okay, now, why did the Saxon kings end? Because another guy came on the scene after Edward dies in 1066. 1066 is famous for another battle called the Battle of Hastings. Do you remember that? Okay, and that was a very famous man by the name of William the Conqueror, okay, who came in, and he was from Normandy, so a little bit of a different place. The Vikings had come to England a little bit before this, and that's really minute history. And William the Conqueror defeated the Anglo-Saxons in the Battle of Hastings, and then all Anglo-Saxon bishops are now supplanted by one from Normandy or Italy, to see how the influence of Rome is now starting to come in a little bit more. So, and then just go up a couple decades, and there's an interesting little thing happening in Canterbury, and you have this person made into an archbishop called Thomas Becket in 1162, and the reason for that was he was a friend of Henry II. Now, I'm not sure exactly what line he was, but he wasn't the Tudor line yet. That didn't happen yet. But Henry II was a friend of Thomas Becket. He got Thomas Becket in as Archbishop of Canterbury because his plan was to gain more control of the church, the priests and the bishops. And so what he wanted to do was he wanted to have the power to try clergy under the secular courts, and he felt that Thomas Becket would help him do that. And so that was one of the things that Henry tried to do through Thomas Becket. But Thomas Becket ended up, once he was the Archbishop of Canterbury, not being as cooperative. And it was overheard one day that Henry II said, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" referring to Thomas Becket. And so people who heard that went, and while the Archbishop was saying Vespers, murdered him at the cathedral. And that was really a sad thing. I went to the Canterbury Cathedral and just knelt there, near that site. You can't go on the site, but I knelt there just thinking about how that occurred in that space, and for that political reason. Okay, after the change now in the movement, in terms of the kings. Normandy is now around. Then you get King John in, and he's the king of Robin Hood fame, if you remember that, okay? So, he starts to fight with the Pope over the new Archbishop of Canterbury, and then John ends up seizing church property as a result of this. The Pope excommunicates him, and whenever your king gets excommunicated, then your country is put under interdict. And so they can't celebrate any of the sacraments or have any of the liturgies, and that becomes a problem politically for them. So, guess what John has to do? He has to bow to the Pope, and he ends up putting together the Magna Carta. So you probably heard of that. So the Magna Carta did these things. First thing, the king will not interfere with the church. That was the first thing it stated. And then it stated that unfair taxes will stop. The king will not ask for extra tax. No freeman will go to prison without a fair trial. All trials will be held quickly and fairly. Merchants can come and go without being unfairly taxed, and so on. And a lot of people felt that John really didn't do England a favor by putting this in. But they also ended up getting the Parliament out of this. And so that was the rise of the Parliament for England out of this Magna Carta, and also the House of Lords, which then kind of like took some of the burden off the king, or either supported the king or sometimes held the king accountable, and there was a back and forth that went on. But that's where Parliament comes from, the Magna Carta. Okay, now, this is kind of interesting. Moving all the way up to the 14th century, so I have the date down there. Whenever John Wycliffe comes around. Now, this is way before Luther did anything, but John Wycliffe and a few people are starting to have discussions about practices in the Roman Catholic Church that they didn't think were good practices. Things like not relying upon Scripture for the source of what you're preaching. There was some movement about selling stuff that ended up becoming indulgences a little bit later on. And then, why is your Bible, why is that kept from the people? You see, why aren't you allowing the Bible to be in English where people can read it? So he was the one that made this argument for an English Bible. And that's the page, okay? 100 years before Luther came around. So there's this feeling going on about, the corruption going on, which kind of like sets the tone for whenever you have Henry VIII coming in and doing what he ends up doing. So the Lawlers are the ones who followed Wycliffe, but they had a hard time staying together after Wycliffe's death in 1384, and so they weren't able to keep his reforms going. And so his reforms died. He was declared a heretic in 1415, and then in 1428 his body was exhumed and burned at the stake. And so you've seen stuff like this because that's just what people did back then, just to make a point. And so, no one's going to mess with what we do church-wise. So those are the corruptions going on. And then, moving a couple of years further, what happens is we start to get the War of the Roses. This is against the Plantagenets and the House of York. Now, who gets defeated at the Battle of Bosworth is Richard III. Shakespeare plays on that. And he gets defeated by a newcomer to the throne whose name is Henry Tudor, Henry VII. The father of Henry VIII. And he was the victor of the Battle of Bosworth Field. And he then became the king. All right. So now, this is the first of the Tudor dynasty. And what we have to remember, looking at Henry VIII, the one who starts the changes in the church, what we have to remember is those Tudors are new. This is a new family coming to power. And it has lots of enemies. Lots and lots of enemies. And a lot of people would like to bring this young Tudor dynasty down. Okay? And let's then set the stage. So, Henry, that would be, let's see how this works. Okay, so Henry VII, in order to, ally or create an alliance, marries Elizabeth of York, who is the niece, I believe, of Richard III, who he conquered. So the two of them get married, and his first son is Arthur. His second son is Henry VIII. Okay, so his first son is Arthur, who gets married in 1501 to Catherine of Aragon. Now, have you been watching The Tudors? Okay, which is that wonderful show that you can get on Netflix. You start to see that. And they were only married for 6 months before Arthur died. And Arthur was childless, okay, that he died. So that's a little bit about the history, just to keep in mind whenever Henry VIII comes to the throne and doesn't have a son. Okay, all right? So that's a real quick history, in terms of, you see the seat of the church going through all kind of different moves. And so this then brings us to, the historical background for the split from Rome. So what we have at the beginning of Henry VIII's reign, there's a lot of conditions ripe for the church. In fact, Wycliffe was there. The Bible is in Latin. People aren't being taught how to read it. Just trust us. We are the smart ones. The monasteries are having all this power. We're starting to do dirty things like maybe self-indulgences here and there, or different ways of doing things. And there's a decline in the medieval church prompted these reform movements. And then whenever Henry VIII assumes the throne, after his father's death in 1509, he gets on the throne. Well, the Reformation is moving. Okay, so the continent now is founded. 100 years after Wycliffe dies, Luther and others are starting to make some movement, on precisely the same problems that Wycliffe was talking about. Now, so you have that pregnantly going, and now England was slower to join the Reformation because there was a distance of an ocean between them, lots of water. So the state of English piety at the beginning of Henry VIII's reign, the clergy and laity are largely uneducated. There's mechanical participation in the liturgy. The Mass is in Latin only, so you don't have a strong clergy. You don't have a real committed laity. There's widespread sub-Christian superstition starting to grow up. They're preoccupied with purgatory, the celibate indulgences. You see, that's still going on, and that's where indulgences started to come in. And there's a thing called the priest mass. And this becomes kind of interesting. So the priest mass were private masses. You see, I could make money, like if your aunt, your mother dies, why don't you buy a few masses from me, And that's why whenever I went to the seminary, we had this big chapel that we had our main celebration, but we had at least 20 side altars. And so while our major liturgy was going on, there was these individual priests having private masses. All the way to 65, whenever I went to the seminary, that was always happening. It was just a matter of form in the Roman Church. Now, see, this was going on in the British Church whenever Henry VIII came up, and people weren't even batting an eye on that. They thought it was goofy, strange, but no one's doing anything there. Decline in monastic piety. You used to go to the monastery because you had a vocation. You're now going to the monastery because this was a way to wealth, you see, and power and prestige. So there's lots of scandal going on, a lot of clerical abuses. An interesting little anecdote is this, and this is in the Catholic Church, which was the Church of Henry VIII. There was a practice going on where the priest said the liturgy with back to people. And you probably see that in some Episcopal churches, right? Like, if you go down to Calvary, the side chapel is like that. And we're doing that priest thing that I have to go to, and we have to do the liturgy with our back facing people, just to have that experience of that whole thing. Now, remember indulgences and stuff like that? Okay, so around that time, there was this superstition starting to rise that if you gazed upon the Eucharist, that you could gain a plenary indulgence. Now, a plenary indulgence wasn't like 300 days off your purgatory. I mean, they had this all figured. A plenary was like if you died and went to purgatory, just having one of those sent up freed you. Okay, you were totally out. This opened up purgatory. Okay, now, so the priest then, in the Catholic Church, would be doing his altar thing, and then he would say the words of consecration over the bread, which was a host by then. And whenever he would do that in Latin, and it became so important for the priest to have a clear conscience to say it. So the words in Latin were hoc est anum meo, which means this is my body. And those were the words that confected transubstantiation. See, with those words, that bread became the actual body and blood of Christ, was the belief back then. Okay, now, England is still holding these kind of beliefs in transubstantiation. So then the priest would say that, and scrupulous priests would repeat that hoc over and over again. You know, it was really incredible because I actually witnessed that. A priest had to have full intention to make this change occur. And so I was serving mass for priests that would go, hoc, 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 hoc. Just making sure, just all that scripture, just to make sure that this was intentional. That's where how crazy it was getting. Then the priest would back to the people, would raise the host over the head, and the bells would ring. And then the big bells in the church would ring. And the reason for that was more indulgence money. Because now the farmers in the fields could be tuned into a host being raised, and they could run from the field, gaze upon the host, gain a couple plenary of indulgences, and go back. So the priests were actually paid more money for the longer they could hold that host up. Now, do we see how crazy things can get? Okay, so this is the background, okay, to Henry VIII coming into his power. So, a couple things then that begin to happen. Okay, so English society is ruled by civil authorities, bishops sometimes in both roles. Travel and trade to England exposed people to the reforming movement. So since there was some back and forth going on, the ideas of Luther spread. The English response to the reformist, wave was mostly negative. Henry VIII was firmly Catholic. In fact, I can't remember the date of it. I think it was 1511 or something like that. Henry VIII penned a pamphlet on the 7 sacraments, which was written, I think it's in the other history there, beginning with Henry VIII. And so he penned this pamphlet on the 7 sacraments, which was against Martin Luther. This was noticed by Pope Clement, who was the Pope of Rome, and he declared Henry VIII defender of the faith. And that was an incredible title, Fidei Defensor. That really made Henry feel good that he had that title bestowed upon him by Rome. And for that he did that. And so now on the continent, Pope Leo, this is still Leo here, and then Clement comes in there at some point, excommunicates Martin Luther, but Luther's writings reach England, and then there's some other movements going on, and Tyndale was the one who did the vernacular Bible. Now the question here is this. That lays the background for Henry's getting a divorce. Okay, that's all going on too. This is the political issue. Now, the split with Rome begins not because of doctrine, but because of politics. And this is really crucial, I think, for us to remember and to realize. So, just backing up a little bit. So Henry VIII gets on the throne, and you have this Catherine of Aragon who's still around, and Henry VIII then marries Catherine of Aragon. Now, the Pope has annulled her first marriage from Arthur, who she was married to for 6 months. They were childless. And Catherine of Aragon testified at her annulment trial that she and Arthur, for those 6 months, never had their marriage consummated. Now, what do you think? 6 months? So anyway, and it was upon that then that Henry VIII, whenever Catherine couldn't have children for him, started to rethink this. So, if you can look on that history that I provided you, look at all those pregnancies that Catherine had. Okay, she was pregnant left and right. I mean, there was tons of them, and she lost child after child. I mean, sometimes one of the kids, Henry one called Henry, he lived for 2 months and died. She had girls, living for an hour. She had so many stillborns. It was really something. But then it was, 16, is that it? When Mary is born. Is that the date? So she has one daughter who survives, and that's Mary, who eventually becomes Bloody Mary. Okay, but she is the daughter and the only child of Henry VIII. Now, politically, here's what's going on. Remember, Tudor family knew Henry VIII, second king only. No male heirs. This is a problem for him because, there's a law out there, spoken and unspoken law, that you can only have a male heir to follow you. And so he's panicked. And so he tries to get the Pope, and it's Clement at that time, to issue him an annulment. And he does it based on Leviticus, that one chapter, that if you lie with your brother's wife, you expose his nakedness. And if you expose his nakedness, then what happens is that you will be cursed, and you will be cursed by not being able to have heirs. And that's what he argues. But the Pope won't hear anything of this, because for the Pope, Catherine of Aragon's nephew is Philip II, I think, or something like that, or I have the name down there, who is the Holy Roman Emperor. So, and Catherine won't give the divorce, and so there's the Pope in his quandary. The Holy Roman Emperor is going to get me if I make this decision to give the annulment. Do you see how political this all is? So, what does Henry end up doing? Well, eventually he just says, hey, forget it. I'm going to get my highest ranking prelate after I name him Archbishop of Canterbury, who's going to be Thomas Cranmer. I'm going to make him the Archbishop, and I'm going to give him the assignment to annul this. And he does. And it's around 33 or something like that where that occurs. And by that time, Henry VIII is already over Catherine, and already he's been through Anne Boleyn's sister Mary, and wanted to make her a concubine, but she refused. And so then he started to go with Anne Boleyn, and they secretly married each other, and she was pregnant with a child, who ends up being Elizabeth I. And so it's under those circumstances then, a little bit later on in 1533, I think it was in November or something like that, Thomas Cranmer declares his marriage to Anne Boleyn to be valid. So the long and short of things then is this. Then Henry needs money and says, look at all those monasteries around here. They got lots of money. Let's go in and start closing them and take over their finances. And they do. Well, that causes problem with some of the commoners, and they have a few different fights with some people. And then it leads up to him being declared the head of the Church of England. And whenever that happens, then it becomes an act of treason not to accept him as the head of the Church of England. And so, and if you do that, then you can get punished by execution. And two very prominent Catholics did that. One of them was called John Cardinal Fisher. He did not accept the king as the head of the Church of England, so he was executed. And Thomas More, who was a delightfully wonderful person, who Henry cried whenever he had to execute him. Just hated to do it, but he had to do it. So, what happens next? John Cardinal Fisher is executed, the first and only cardinal ever to be martyred. The Pope, who is now Paul III, cannot overlook this, and he now excommunicates Henry VIII, and he excommunicates Thomas Cranmer, and now Rome and England are separate. And we now have the birth of the Church of England. So, people ask the question, why does our liturgy in the Episcopal Church look like the Catholic Church? Here's the answer. Because it was never a theological split. It was never a liturgical split. It was a political split. And that's extremely significant. That's why the right of succession and all those things remain. So, Henry dies, a Roman Catholic to the end, but the head of the church, so nothing changed. There's a lot of reforms going on, you know. Thomas Cranmer is trying to make things like married clergy come in and do a few things like that. Henry's not in favor of those. He makes very few changes. You know, he keeps, whenever he's the king. He gets rid of a couple of shrines, including the shrine to Thomas a Becket. And so, but he doesn't do much, and he dies pretty much like a traditional Catholic, okay, although in the Church of England. So, the kingdom now goes to his son, who is 9 years old, called Edward. Now, Edward was raised by his uncle, Edmund, who was the brother of Jane Seymour. If you remember her, she was the third wife of Henry VIII, and the one that he loved the most, apparently. And so now Edmund Seymour raised the little king, and when Henry VIII died, Edmund Seymour was Protestant, and so Edward acted Protestantly. So what started happening is all the Catholic bishops are out and the new ones are in, and so you start to get all kind of things. The vernacular is happening, the Book of Common Prayer starts to get written, in 1549. All these different kind of interesting things start to occur. You can't have processions anymore, get rid of all of the statues and all the icons. So that happens. And Edward lives for, I think, 6 years, something like that, and then dies. And the next heir is Mary, who is Catholic. So Henry VIII, Catholic. Edward, Protestant. Mary, Catholic. So everything that happened in terms of the Reformations are now changed, and all of the reformers are moved back to the continent, and all the Catholics are coming up, and then Mary is able to get a guy by the name of Reginald Pole to come in, who becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury eventually. He gets the reinstatement of heresy trials, and they put Thomas Cranmer on trial for heresy. And they end up burning him at the stake after he does a whole recantation. And she ends up killing over 250 people at the stake and earned her title Bloody Mary. She dies after 6 years, and in comes Elizabeth. And Elizabeth tries to sort out and put together the Protestant and the Catholic. So, and she successfully does that. To make a long story short, she gets two acts of Parliament passed. One of them was the Act of Supremacy, and the other was the Act of, I think it was something like Equality or something. Do you remember the name of that? There was another one. The Act of Supremacy made her governess of the Church of England. Interesting little tidbit. Her father was called not governor, head of the Church of England, but because she was a woman, she was governor of the Church of England, but it was the same thing. And she then, got the uniformity. That was the Act of Uniformity, where everything in England, then church-wise, liturgical-wise, would be the same. And that's whenever the Book of Common Prayer came back again. And the one that was done in 1552 was put on hold because Edward died, and so that one was back with some tweaks reinstated. And so she developed then a way of bringing the Protestant and the Catholic together, and you can look in my notes. I have all the things Catholic that she allowed in there and all the things Protestant that she allowed in there, and that is known as the middle way, or the via media, the middle way. And that's also known as the Elizabethan settlement. So that's all the way up to 1603. And so I know that was fast and it moved, and there's a lot more that we could have said, and I hope I didn't eat too much of Daryl's time.
Thank you. Well, what I can promise you is that I will not be as animated as Father, but I beg you not to fall asleep if you can. I have to blaze through this so we can stay around our time allotment here. So there are actually a few slides that we kind of, Regis kind of skipped through. I won't talk, he's talked about Thomas Cranmer, that's Cranmer. Some of the reforms during Cranmer, sermons were encouraged with a focus on scripture. That was new. Priests could marry now, and they got rid of all the Catholic-minded bishops and put Protestant or Reformist-minded bishops in during him. Down here, I'm not going to go into these. If time permitted, we could talk about the 42 articles of religion, which were established during Cranmer's time. Regis talked about Mary Tudor, talked about the bloodbath that happened. Why do you think Mary was unsuccessful in wiping out the reformist consciousness that existed? She did a lot. I mean, you know, she killed everything. England was back under the Pope, but she could not kill the reformist movement as hard as she tried. Why do you think that was? Yes?
No one liked her. No one liked her. She was married to the King of Spain.
I think that was part of it. No one liked her. Yeah. She wasn't a real popular lady. No. Why else, though? Any other reasons that you could think of? Why couldn't she just kill off that reformist consciousness? Too widespread. You see, what had happened under Cranmer and Edward was the people got a taste of these wonderful reforms, and they could hear the Mass in English. A Bible was available for them to read. They could look and read and study Scripture. That was a big deal. So now Mary comes in and she's going to take all that away? Well, no, I don't think so. Okay? So she wasn't successful. Regis covered this, so I'm not going to go into this in detail. Elizabeth brought stability to the church. She was one strong lady. Okay? And she said, enough of this. Okay? Catholic, Protestant, Catholic, what are we going to be? So she settled the issue during her lengthy reign. Okay? But she wasn't without her own problems. Because this reformist movement that was on the continent really had an increasing influence on the English Reformation. Who am I talking about on the continent? And aren't there any Presbyterians in here who would know? What was happening on the continent that was having a huge impact on the English Reformation? Begins with C. Calvin, and another guy, Zwingli. Okay? So they had, come into great